Hi there, folks. Sorry you didn't have a reading from last week, but we are now on Chapter 5. As Bad Dave's 30-foot sloop moved through the reefs, Dave, Dr. Cooper, and Jay could see that the remote island of Curnow certainly held little that would interest any visitors. The island was small and flat, and except for an even carpeting of coconut-laden palm trees, it was featureless. Dave knew how to find the village on the lee side of the island, and now they had it in sight, a tiny and unimpressive cluster of grass huts and one very ugly structure constructed of rusting corrugated metal and pieces of World War II airplanes. One wall was mostly the wing from a Japanese Zero, the emblem of the rising sun plainly visible. Dave explained, "The only people ever interested in this little island were the Japanese during the war. I've heard they used to have a secret airstrip on this little lump." Dr. Cooper was looking at the village through binoculars. "An airstrip, eh? Big enough to land a Starlifter? If it's really there in the first place, and if you had the manpower to repair and lengthen it." "Oh, I would say they have all the men they need." Dave nodded grimly. Kelly was telling the truth. The commies are here all right, and probably aren't too happy to see us. Dr. Cooper handed the binoculars to Jay, who took a look. He could see that many heavily armed, rough-looking characters were already gathering at the crude dock in front of the village, staring at the strange boat approaching. "Just how are we supposed to get through that bunch?" Jay asked. "I'm wondering how Mrs. Flaherty got through them," said Dr. Cooper. Dave only shook his head. "Well, I told her not to set out alone, but she was afraid of losing their trail if she waited for you two. But she has her tricks, you'll see." "What's our trick?" Jay asked. "Hey, no problem. You're Christians. You know the Bible and how to act religious. We'll just tell them you're friends of Reverend Garrison, the missionary. Hopefully by the time they ask you, Garrison will have gotten there to introduce himself, and you'll be telling the truth." Dave eased back on the throttle and let the sloop ease gently toward the dock. A dozen communist rebels dressed in dull camouflage fatigues and carrying machine guns were on the dock. Only one caught the rope and helped to pull the boat alongside. The other 11 only stared at their arrivals and held their machine guns ready. Dave waved and smiled at the guerrillas, so Dr. Cooper and Jay did the same. Dave said in a lowered voice, "I know the commander. Let me do the talking." He stepped onto the dock to have a few words with the first man he encountered, a dark, very muscular man dressed in khaki, a large rifle slung on his back. Dave rattled off a quick, overly friendly explanation in a Filipino dialect while the rebel leader studied Dr. Cooper and Jay for a very long, very scary moment. The man was apparently spouting some protests and angry questions, and Dave tried to answer them. The man laughed a cruel, conniving laugh and gave Dave a taunting shove. Dave tried to explain some more, but the rebel was through talking. Whatever Dave had said, the rebel didn't buy it. He growled some orders to his men, and every gun suddenly pointed right at the 3 intruders. Dave put his hands up and interpreted what the angry man was yelling at them. Better put your hands up, and he wants you to get out of the boat, right now." Dr. Cooper looked at Jay as they both raised their hands. So much for tricks. They slowly started to climb out of the boat. These communists were a rough bunch. They even smelled rough. Just then, a voice shouted from the land, "Randy, Jack, praise God, what a surprise!" Every eye turned toward the shore to see a jolly, deeply tanned, chubby man in a pair of faded beach pants trotting down the dock toward them, arms outstretched, his wide smile shining in the sun. Right behind him were 2 natives in woven grass skirts, also smiling broadly and chattering away in their own language. The guerrillas began to lose some of their fierceness. Several gun barrels sank slowly. Some of the men even seemed disappointed. David shouted happily, spreading his arms for a hug. Well, Jerry, long time no see. Dave and the chubby fellow collided in an embrace, patted each other's back, and had some good loud laughs. Jerry, Dr. Cooper shouted with a smile, extending his hand. Yeah, Jerry, Jay shouted too, figuring it was the best thing to do. Jerry reached down to them and gave them a very strong helping hand out of the boat and onto the dock. So how are things, Jerry asked. Oh, fine, just fine, said Dr. Cooper. And Mary? She's fine too. Well, say, I thought you'd never get here. Listen, I've got your room all set up in the church. Come on and I'll get you settled. Any luggage? Well, Moki, Sulu, Jerry called on his two native accomplices, and then chattering some orders to them. They leaped into the boat and picked up the Cooper's gear. Come on, let's have lunch. With that, the chubby man took the lead and began clearing a path through the guerrillas and guns. The three visitors followed him off the dock, followed in turn by the gear-toting natives. Keep laughing, Jerry told them quietly. So they kept laughing, talking, pointing at things, making up names, doing anything they could think of to look like old chums, and kept it up until they had gotten deeper into the forest and out of sight. This way, said Jerry, leading them down a path through the palm trees. After going just a short distance, they came to a small structure without walls, nothing more than a grass roof set on poles. Underneath the roof were some crude log benches arranged like church pews, and in front, a simple pulpit. Welcome to Curno Congregational, the gospel outreach of the South Seas, said Jerry. Then he extended his hand for real and said, Jerry Garrison. What are your real names, Randy and Jack? Dr. Jake Cooper, and I'm Jay. And I hope you know a Mary. Dr. Cooper smiled. Well, I do have a cousin, Mary, and as far as I know, she is really fine. Good enough. I probably shouldn't have used deception just now, but anyway, you can see you've come at a bad time. I don't know if you're looking for trouble, but we've had plenty right now. They're looking for a missing plane, said Dave. Dr. Cooper's daughter is on board. Jerry's eyes widened. Oh, is that so? He nodded to himself, thought a few thoughts, and then said in a hushed voice, These commies have been here for a month or so, working on a deserted Japanese airstrip on the other side of the island. Dr. Cooper and Jay exchanged excited glances. Praise God, said Dr. Cooper. Looks like we're on the right track. But Jerry wasn't smiling yet. Oh, but you'd better be careful before you take one step, sir. These guerrillas mean business, and they are not kind to anyone they don't trust. You saw the murder in their faces. Jerry stepped just a little closer to mutter the next piece of information. And I think things are worse now. They haven't said anything to me, but from the way they act and talk, I'm sure something's gone wrong. Their plane isn't working out. What do you mean? 3 days ago, they all went to the other side of the island to the airstrip and waited, but nothing happened and no airplane came. Ever since then, they've been very agitated and suspicious, with boats and men coming and going, and show no mercy on strangers with no good reason to be here. I'm very glad I saw your boat land and got out there in time. You could have been shot right there, you know. Why weren't we? Asked Dave. Jerry smiled. I've been good to the guerrillas. I fed them, showed them hospitality. Usually they permit friends of mine to go on living, just like that other visitor, that lady. Dave knew who that was. Megan Flaherty? But Jerry only gave Dave a funny look. Who? A very lovely woman, long, shimmering red hair, about this tall. Jerry only shook his head. No, heavens, no. You think a beautiful woman would last more than 1 hour among this terrible bunch? No, this was a cloth trader, an old woman from one of the southern islands. I convinced the guerrillas that they could use some materials to patch their clothes and such, so they let her come ashore to do business. Now Dave was giving Jerry a funny look. Just where might we find this woman? Oh, I imagine she'd be down at the trading store. You know that old shack made of Japanese airplane scraps? The island's trade store, just like bad days back on Polosapi, was the center of island commerce. The little scrap metal building where goods and supplies were bought and sold, stories were swapped, drinks were served. It was a tight, smelly little place that had been washed away a few times by tidal waves, but pieced together again out of whatever debris happened to float along. In this case, leftover airplane parts. At the moment, the place was packed with idle communist rebels, all facing toward the center of the room, where a table, made from an airplane tail, had been set up. Two people sat at the table opposite each other. A strong, handsome native with muscular body and dark skin, and an old native woman, the cloth trader, heavy-set, gray, dressed in all manner of brightly colored materials as an advertisement of her wares. On the table between the two was a small pile of coins and a gold locket on a chain. In front of each person was a tin plate. On each tin plate was a heaving, oozing, crawling mass of very large snails, crawling over and around each other, their antennae weaving and probing about. Several empty shells on each plate showed that many snails had already disappeared. A bet was clearly on. The man reached for a snail, tugged it from the tin plate, held the shell in his hand, and then dug the snail out with a small fork. With a very cocky expression, he threw back his head and dropped the snail into his mouth, swallowing it whole. He washed it down with a small glass of liquor. Now all eyes were on the old woman. The whole place was murmuring with anticipation. She smiled a jagged, toothy smile and did the same thing, dropping a snail into her mouth and swallowing it. She washed it down with a small glass of water. Now all eyes were on the man, wondering what he would do. He looked just a little sick, but he kept forcing a sly smile anyway, and this time he dug out 2 snails and swallowed both of them at once, following that with another gulp of liquor. All eyes shifted to the woman. She pondered her next move for just a moment, then smiled her toothy grin, cackled a little, and dug out 4 snails, chomping them down and downing another glass of water. There was a roar of anticipation this time as all eyes turned to the man. Could he match that? Would he try to top it? He took a deep breath, stretched his body to ease the pressure on his swelling belly, and then reached for 6 snails as the crowd went wild with hoots and laughter. Into his mouth they went. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. His cheeks were puffed out as he chomped on the slimy mass. He swallowed several times and then grabbed desperately for another glass of liquor. The old woman pondered her next move, but she also had an eye on her opponent. He did seem to be weaving a bit. He was holding his mouth shut very tightly as if expecting an explosion of some kind. She smiled her toothy smile, let out a cry of glee, and began to dig out 6, then 7, and then 8 snails, lifting each one up for the man to see. He watched her prepare each and every snail one by one, his eyes getting glassy, his face turning quite pale. With all 8 snails ready in her hand, she threw her head back, lifted the snails high over her mouth, and the man suddenly clamped his hand over his mouth and ran from the room. The gorillas roared and cheered. The old lady dropped the 8 snails back into the tin plate and smiled a smile of obvious relief, shoving the plate aside. Someone took the snails away. The bet was over. She reached for the coins in the locket, dropped them into a little pouch, and rose to leave as the crowd continued to cheer and pay off some of the bets they had made with each other. Many had bet on the woman, and they were hilarious in victory. Some had bet on the man, and most of them were good sports about it. One man, however, had lost his bet and didn't feel good about it at all. As the old woman made her way to the door, he stood in her path, very tall, very mean. 2 other men joined him, one on each side, and together they formed a very ugly wall. The woman stopped and looked up at them, her face full of questions. The man put out his hand. He wanted that little pouch. His two friends were hitting their palms with their fists, a very threatening gesture. "Hey, what do you know?" came a voice behind them. The three roughnecks were startled and turned to see who it was. Two men and a lad were standing in the doorway. The old woman didn't hesitate, but tossed the pouch to the man in the middle. That man happened to be Jake Cooper. "Look out, man," hollered Bad Dave as the three rebels came at them. Bad Dave planted his fist squarely on the jaw of the man on the left. Dr. Cooper was able to flip the middle one aside. Jay dove between the legs of the third assailant and came up on the other side just in time to catch the pouch tossed to him by his father. Two more rebels came at Jay, so he dove under the table and then wriggled across the floor just out of their reach. One rebel almost grabbed his heel, but the old woman managed to stick her leg out just in time to trip him. His head met the edge of the table with a crunch, and he became just another rug on the floor. Jay was about to be sacked by a towering wave of communists, but he saw the old woman in the clear and hit her with a short pass. The first man who came after her got his eye poked, so he stumbled about, getting in the way of the others. That gave the woman just enough time to toss the pouch back to Dr. Cooper. "Intercepted!" A lanky, dirty rebel snatched the pouch out of the air with a cry of victory and held it aloft for the others to see. And then it was out of his hands, snatched away by Jay, who immediately turned to run. The rebel grabbed Jay around the middle and lifted him up, but that only gave Jay the perfect opportunity to kick another man's face and send him sprawling. As for the rebel holding him, both his arms were occupied, so he could do nothing to prevent the old woman from shattering a bottle on his head. He let go of Jay on the way to the floor, and Jay tossed the pouch to Dr. Cooper again, which meant Dr. Cooper had to immediately stoop to let a rebel flop over him, and then spring upward to send the rebel flying over the bar. A kick from Dr. Cooper's boot took care of a second attacker, just in time for the old woman to slip by on her way out the door. Dr. Cooper handed off the pouch to her, and she dashed out the door with another gorilla right behind her. Suddenly, the door closed, and the gorilla's face came to a sudden stop against it. He tumbled backward to the floor. "Oh," said the old woman in mock pity, peeking around the corner. Some guns were coming out now. The game was getting very dangerous. But Bad Dave called a halt to everything with one simple act. "Hey, everybody," he shouted in it, and it was amazing how fast he got everyone's attention. Maybe it was because he held a stick of dynamite in his hand, the fuse lit and burning. Everyone in the room instantly became a statue. Then, after only a split second, every opening in the building, even if it was a window, became a door. Gorillas and natives alike were popping out of that little shack like cannon fire, scattering in all directions. "Let's go," said Dave, holding the dynamite high over his head for all to see. He bolted out the door, followed by the Coopers and the old woman. And everyone cleared the way for them with the utmost courtesy. They ran for the forest, heading back toward the church. But Dr. Cooper could see that fuse getting very short. "Dave, drop that thing. You're going to get us all killed." "Not until we're safe." "Safe," yelled Jay. "I don't feel very safe right now." "Aw, you worry too much." They kept running until they came to the church. The fuse kept burning shorter and shorter. It was down to an inch now. The Coopers dove into the brush, covering their heads. Dave and the old woman just stood there, watching the fuse burn down. Finally it did. "Not bad," said Dave, looking at the dead stick of dynamite. The old woman spoke for the first time, and it was startling to hear the old Polynesian speaking with such a crisp Irish accent. "Dave, one of these days you'll try that trick twice on the same bunch, and then where will you be?" Dr. Cooper's head rose out of the grass, and then Jay's, and they looked back toward the trail where Dave and the woman stood. As they watched from a safe distance, Dave peeled the wrapping off the dynamite and then peeled what it really was. A banana. He took a bite, then offered a bite to the woman. She reached into her mouth first and removed her jagged, false teeth so she could bite into it with her own. Dave started laughing, his cheek full of banana. Hey, come on, boys. Come share a banana with the jewel of the South Pacific. And everywhere else, too. Mrs. Megan Flaherty. Dr. Cooper and Jay looked at each other, and Dr. Cooper could only sigh. Sonny said, "We've been had." As they came out of hiding, the old woman removed her gray wig and let a cascade of red locks fall. She extended her hand. "Dr. Jacob Cooper, I heard much about you and your children from our mutual friend, Colonel William Griffith." He shook her hand, still amazed. "Pleased to meet you. This is my son, Jay." She shook his hand as well. "A pleasure, Jay." Dave handed her a damp cloth, and she wiped the native darkness and the lines of age from her skin, revealing a fair complexion underneath. Dave smiled, very proud of her. "I was wondering how you figured you'd survive among that rowdy bunch." "I almost didn't." "It was going well for a time, but things were taking a nasty turn when you three showed up. I'm very grateful." "But just what was that all about?" asked Dr. Cooper. "We had ourselves an all-out brawl back there, and we could have been killed. And for what? A little pouch of money?" She brought out the pouch. "No, not the money. I wouldn't swallow raw snails for any amount of that. But that man had a locket, and my eye caught the name on it. I thought you'd be interested." She reached into the pouch and pulled out the locket. It was gold and delicate, a small heart on a chain. She turned it over and placed it in Dr. Cooper's hand. Dr. Cooper recognized it immediately. Jay did too. They were both familiar with the inscription on the back. "To my daughter Lila on her 13th birthday." See you next time for Chapter 6.